My privilege to introduce our speaker today, Pastor Andy Wileman, Senior Pastor of Grace Bible Church here in Dallas, Texas. Andy is native of Tyler, Texas, and a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin with a degree in business. Were you doing something there? After graduation, he married Julie, and together they bought and sold a business in East Texas. Then Andy attended Dallas Theological Seminary, where he served on the administration and faculty. He served under both Dr. John Walvoord and Dr. Don Campbell in the president's office, and he has wonderful stories to tell. He was also the first executive director of the Center for Christian Leadership, serving alongside of Professor Howard Hendricks. While working at the seminary, he attended Grace Bible Church. He left the seminary to return to business for a few years, but then joined the staff at Grace Bible as associate pastor in 1993, and then in 2002, he became the senior pastor. He has 2 grown daughters who are married and 5 grandchildren, and he has many interests, including studying leadership and history, enjoying jazz music, and cheering on the Longhorns. Listen closely to this, please. Andy believes that followers of Christ should take themselves less seriously while taking the Lord much more seriously. And if you know Andy Wileman, you know that statement to be true on both accounts. Would you please join me in welcoming Pastor Andy Wileman today?
It is a privilege to be here today. We have a staff prayer meeting on Wednesday, and I was meeting with some of our staff and said, I need you to pray for me tomorrow. I'm speaking at the seminary. I have spoken in front of men's groups and business groups and all kinds of groups. The one kind of group that makes me nervous is preachers. I just get nervous around preachers. And with all due respect, I've got several of our churches here because they want to hear if I'm any good, but especially a very special friend. Chris Simmons is here. Chris is pastor of Cornerstone Baptist Church on Martin Luther King, and he and I have created a nonprofit together, and I am excited beyond words to be involved in seeing what our 2 churches might do together in that community. Chris Jones is here with him, one of our volunteers who spends 30 hours a week down there, and there is nothing I'm doing that I'm as excited about as that. So don't tell the church that, but it's just a really special time. First, I want to say how much I'm grateful for DTS in my life. Growing up in Texas, you hear a lot of the war stories, and you hear about the especially alumni who have train wrecks, and you experience a few of those. And I grew up a Presbyterian. I was baptized by one of the Presbyterian ministers who founded Dallas Seminary with Dr. Chafer along with Will Anderson. And I didn't realize that until I was in the president's office and I was reading histories of the seminary. And I went to see Dr. Walvoord and said, "Did you know Dr. Robert Hill?" He said, "Of course. He was one of the founders." I said, "He baptized me as an infant." Get over it. If you're a Baptist, get over it. You know what the Presbyterians said to the Baptists? They were debating baptism, and he said, let me get this straight. If I go up to here, am I baptized? And the Baptist said, "No, you're not baptized." He said, what if I go up to the neck? Am I baptized? He said, "No." He said, "What if I go up to here in the water? Am I baptized?" He said, "So I've got to get the very top of my head wet to be baptized." The Baptist said, "Yes." Presbyterian said, "And?" By the way, I'm going to tell you a secret. I told Scott Harrell this a number of years ago. Dr. Walvoord was never rebaptized. He was baptized as an infant, and one day he said, "Andy, I never was rebaptized. Please don't tell anyone." And because the majority of the alumni and constituents are from Baptist circles. But I had strong Presbyterian bias, and I struggled with whether I should come to Dallas, and was under care of the Texas Presbytery, the PCA, throughout my years here, and got a lot of grief for it. They felt like dispensationalism was something akin to witchcraft, and And Dr. Walver was incredibly supportive, and it was Ed Bloom, a faculty member, who helped me walk through the issue of infant baptism. And because I went to him and said, am I at the wrong seminary? And he said, Andy, all the founders were Presbyterians except for one Anglican. Let's talk. And I've told Dr. Bloom, you probably saved me at DTS, and I've never felt like he was encouraged by that. I always got the sense he regretted it just a little bit. He went on to be the editor of the Holman Christian Study Bible, and had an amazing ministry and was one of my favorite faculty. But I had heard all the stories about the doctrine and everything, and I came a little bit biased. And my first 2 years, I worked in Uptown in the financial industry with a company that one of the principals ultimately was convicted of felony charges. I was the only guy in Greek class worried about getting subpoenaed, I'm fairly sure. And so when Dwayne Lindsay, who was the registrar, came to me and said, would you like to be my assistant? I jumped on it. And I started at by the time I left the registrar's office, I was making $9,000 a year, right? The financial planning company offered me 3 times that if I'd come back. I said, I don't think so. And the registrar's office, I had the privilege of working in the academic world and get to know faculty. You know, I would read Harold Honer's comments on PhD dissertations, except for you couldn't read them. They were impossible. They were horrible, hen-scratching. And we would deliver them to the student. He'd say, what am I supposed to do with this? And we'd say, I don't know, you know. Dr. Honer will come back later in some of my stories because they're always great Harold stories. And then my senior year, we had just had a child. Julie and I had committed that we weren't going to stop living just because we were in seminary. I think that's one of the mistakes that so often happens. You get into this mode of, I'm going to wait till I graduate. We said, no, this is part of our life together. So we had our kids while we were in seminary. In my 5th year, we had our 3rd child, Emily, 2nd child, excuse me, and the business office manager at the time, Jim Tim's father-in-law, Jim Anderson, came to me and said, can you write letters? Well, I'm from East Texas. I'm thinking A, B, I'm pretty good at that. And he said, no, I mean like correspondence. I said, I guess, I don't know. He said, well, we've all recommended you to Dr. Walvert as his new assistant because Rick Dunham is leaving. And Rick now has a fundraising consulting firm here in Dallas. And I said, okay. So I went in, and Dr. Walvert is this, I'd never met the man. I'd sat through chapel. If you didn't know, he was huge. He'd played football for Wheaton. He loved to tell the story about one of the football games in which he was across the line from a much bigger and better player. And he said, we just got trounced, and the coach at Wheaton had us all standing in line, was chewing us out individually. And he said, he got to me, and my face was so bloodied, and I looked so bad, he just shook his head and moved on to the next guy. So Dr. Walvert was this imposing figure, and he said, everybody says I should hire you. Do you want to work for me? I thought, well, that's warm. I said, may I have a night to pray? He said, well, I guess so. And he said, I said, well, are you going to pay me for this job? He said, well, what do you need to make? And I said, and this gives you a little insight into my personality, I said, are we talking rice and beans? What are we talking here, Dr. Walvert? He said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you $16,000 until you finish your THM, then you'll get $19,000. But put that in context, Dr. Walvert took over for Chafer 7 years before he became president. Dr. Chafer had a stroke, I think it was, and was essentially bedridden the last 7 years. Dr. Chafer never communicated about the seminary's financial needs. He had read about George Mueller, was so grace-oriented, he was extremely careful about that. Dr. Walvert said, I believe the Apostle Paul's example in 2 Corinthians tells me I have a responsibility to tell people about the need. Never manipulate, but give them an opportunity to share in what God is doing here. He said, Andy, when I first started, after we wrote the first letter, for the first time, hear this, the faculty got their full payroll. Before that, faculty contracts were a joke because they would agree to an amount, but they never had the money. And faculty would literally go in hat in hand at times and say, I got to get some money now. And the reason I tell you that is, I came and walked through buildings this morning beforehand because they've changed so much, and I had a part in some of these buildings, and it's just fun to see. It's so beautiful now, so powerful, we neglect to realize the price that was paid in the early days. Founders pay huge prices. They went without pay. All of the faculty had pastorates on the side, whether they were any good or not. Some of them didn't need to be pastors, but they needed to be pastors. And they sacrificed in a huge way. And Dr. Walford, one of his greatest points of pride was that when I communicated about the need, from then on, everybody got paid. Now, hear me. We got all kinds of grief from the very same faculty about how we did fundraising. And I was talking to a present faculty member not too long ago, and he said, well, I'm not sure about this and that. And I said, well, you really ought to appreciate it because you are getting paid. And one of the themes I want to say, Kim Till is here, one of my favorite people. You have an obligation to be grateful for the donors and the staff who works with them and for the heritage that goes by, because it is their amazing sacrifice on your behalf and for the sake of the church that makes this education possible. My first job in the president's office was handling donor correspondence. I signed 2,000 letters a week by hand. At Christmas, it became 2,000 letters a day by hand. And Dr. Walford did that because he said anybody who gives $1 or more, I believe that if they're willing to give us $1, then they've prayed for us. And that prayer is worth a thank you. And that was the foundation of what I did. And I would answer correspondence to these donors and widows that lived on Social Security who would literally send their mites. And over time, I developed a huge reverence for the men and women who sacrificed so much to make this place work. And it's same in your church and same in all nonprofit organizations. Don't take that for granted. That is a huge ministry that we often speak of in terms that I think are embarrassing to the Lord. And Dr. Walford hammered me on those donor thank yous. In fact, don't tell anybody everything I'm saying to you today. I mean, let's be careful, but the worst chewing out I ever received in my life was from Dr. Walford. He came in, he'd been out of town, and he had gotten the wrong impression that I'd messed up something on donor thank you letters. And he called me into his office, and the Shekinah glory had filled the space, and he wore me out like I have never been worn out before or since. He never raised his voice. He certainly used no inappropriate language, but it was as if he took every joint in my fingers and broke each one off individually and then moved to the next finger before going to my toes, arms, legs. It was unbelievable experience. It really was. I've never experienced anything about it like it. And the reason I tell you that is he had a ferocious commitment to this place. It was ferocious. It was such a focus of his life that if he thought someone didn't do the job well, he was generally incredibly gracious, but I happened to catch him on a bad day. And he wore me out. Bill Bryan, the previous chaplain, said, I had one of those. Dr. Walford called me in one time after he had retired to chancellor, and he was upset, and he said, I'll never forget it. But you know what's great about Dr. Walford? 2 hours later, when we had both calmed down, I walked into his office and said, Dr. Walford, I accept this. I disagree with you on this. I don't think this was fair. And he looked me in the eyes and said, you know, I think I was really upset about something else. You're right. And we were friends from then on. Because it wasn't personal. He was so committed to this school. And you have to understand about Dr. Walford, he is a man who lived a life in incredible tragedy. He has 4 sons. One is in the Denton State School. He is incapacitated to the level of a 2 or 3-year-old. One never got past about 12 years old, James, whom I knew and died a few years back, and he was in private homes. And the year before I moved into the office, his son Timothy, who was my age, was killed in a car accident the month he finished medical school. He had one surviving son, John, who was one of the smartest people I've ever been around. And Dr. Walford loved this school and served it in the midst of a kind of pain that most of us will never comprehend. And my admiration for him is endless. In fact, I filled out a federal jury trial questionnaire. You get those dreaded things and just pray God you don't. I did a 2-week murder trial once. I think I've done my time. And they asked me for heroes, and I put John Walford as one of them because he was an author, he was a theologian, he had a degree in philosophy from TCU. He and his son John helped create direct mail fundraising. What we did in direct mail fundraising was literally state of the art. Now, nobody does it like that anymore, but he was an astounding man. But he did it in the midst of mind-numbing pain. Mind-numbing pain. And he did it out of a deep motivation. He came to Dallas Seminary planning to be a missionary in China, and when China's doors closed, Dr. Chafer saw the brilliance, and he spent his whole life here. And we maintained our friendship after I left and met periodically until he died. And I will never get over the privilege of knowing what I consider one of the great men of my generation. Then I had the privilege of walking through the transition with Dr. Campbell. Dr. Walford would not have been successful without Dr. Campbell in so many ways, because Dr. Walford was very Dutch, very to the point, very direct, and Dr. Campbell was that oil that soothed the relationships. He was the one who loved the faculty and buffered the faculty, and you know, he had an amazing role of doing that with incredible integrity. And in my conviction, he was the only human possible who could have replaced Dr. Walford, because the shadow of Dr. Walford was so long that it had to be someone like Dr. Campbell. Dr. Campbell, as president, buried his wife, Bee, cared for her as she fought melanoma, and served her in the midst of caring for Bee, who Julie had taught. My wife had been in a Schofield class with Bee Campbell, and so it was a very personal thing for us as well. Of course, I knew Dr. Swindoll. He was a board member then. I picked him up at the airport one time. I'll never forget it. And I had just started the Leadership Center with Prof. Hendricks, and Dr. Swindoll started talking about working with Prof. Hendricks, and I had a little car. It was a seminary car. You know what I mean. It was a little car. And Dr. Swindoll gestures in a little car the same way he does in a pulpit. I'm literally driving from DFW, dodging his gestures as we go along. And Dr. Swindoll obviously brought his reputation and had made a huge impact at DTS. And then Dr. Bailey and I taught a Bible study together for 16 years, ended a couple of years back. And his humility and his grace and his leadership, I know Mark Yarbrough, thanks God to get to follow someone like that and have him here. And I'm thrilled to see Mark Yarbrough. I followed his career. We never worked together, but he was clearly the choice from God. I've heard no one criticize the choice of Mark Yarbrough. Now, I've not talked to his wife, but everyone else I know has been very happy that Mark is the present president, and I'm thrilled with it. When I got to DTS, it was the height of maleness at Dallas Seminary. We only had men. We only had the THM. Each year they accepted 250 men. The first year class every year was 250 men in the THM. And I came from the University of Texas by way of East Texas. At UT, it was the end of the Vietnam era. It was the dope-smoking, you know, UT. We're the Berkeley of the Southwest. And so I show up here, and at UT, we're glad if people wear clothes. And at Dallas Seminary, they're telling me how I've got to dress. We had to wear suits. And it was the era of double knit. It was so awful. I mean, guys would go to thrift shops and grab double knit, and double knit shrinks over time, and you would see 6 different plaids on one human being. It was just staggering how bad we looked. And you couldn't have beards, except for those guys who claimed to the dean of student that they had a skin problem. There was a mass problem with skin problems. And so there were guys that didn't have beards, but their sideburns came to here on both sides. One of those was a friend of mine who went on to go to Oxford, and I kept saying, "Come on, man, what's?" He said, "It's not a beard. It's not a beard, and I've got a skin problem." So I was here during the years when the seminary started bringing other degree programs on campus. They were originally only in the summers, and then they started bringing the MA into campus, and they started open programs to women. And when I taught leadership with Prof. Hendricks, clearly some of the best students, I really still remember some of the students in that class who were women who were breaking the curve for everyone else. And there's no question that change brought a new health to DTS, and it was a thrill to be a part of that. But it wasn't an easy decision. Part of what happens with a conservative theology is a conservative worldview, and change is hard for conservatives. And every time you bring change, the CEO suffers for it. But the seminary has continually sought to do that, and I'm grateful for it. They set our classes by alphabet. My first job in the registrar's office, I assigned all student classes, and you were assigned by alphabet. So in my class, I know the W's. I don't know the A's, literally, because we always went by alphabet. And then as I was in the registrar's office, we started loosening up and actually let students request changes in their scheduling. It was radical. And then by the time I graduated, you could request changing from 4 years to 5 years. It was much more rigid, much more uniform. And in some ways it was great, but in other ways it needed to change. And it was a privilege to have a part in that. I had visited DTS as a high school student. The reason I came to Dallas instead of a Presbyterian seminary was Mike Fisher, who had, when he was a seminary student, he would drive down and work at Pine Cove for the weekend, and then they baited and switched him, literally. They promised him a salary, and then after he started, they said, by the way, you also have to go by this little Presbyterian church and be the youth pastor 2 hours a day. And Mike, the little 200-person Presbyterian church, that youth group grew to 85 people. And 6 of us came to Dallas Seminary at the same time. And Mike brought me to visit class, and I'll never forget sitting in Bruce Walke's Hebrew class. Men were crying. They were so afraid of him. Bruce Walke was, by every account, was a gentle, kind man. He goes to an Anglican church now that my daughter used to attend in Washington. Was an incredibly kind man, but he just had no understanding of mortals. He was a little absent-minded. Famous story that he drove to Houston for a speaking engagement and forgot and flew back, which was awkward. He told on himself that he got really frustrated in his office one day because he was looking up a word and couldn't find it in his dictionary. And then after 30 minutes, he realized he was looking at his French dictionary. That's not normal, you know? And so as a professor, as gentle and kind as he was, I watched these older guys all but in tears, afraid he'd call on them. I'm kid you not. He was a monstrous mind, and he discipled and impacted the Hebrew department for many years to come. Alan Ross had a huge impact on me, who was a disciple of Bruce Walke. And then I heard Prof. Hendricks on that high school trip. And that would bring about a whole new part of my life because of Prof's remarkable gifts. And I'm so thrilled that it's called the Hendricks Center, and my old friend Bill and I served at Pine Cove together when we were both in high school. Darrell Bach and I went to UT together. He's never learned how to stick a shirt tail in. Have you noticed that? He couldn't at Austin. He can't here. Poor Darrell cannot keep a shirt tail in his pants. It's a tragic thing. He's pretty good at Greek, and so I think one of the real joys I had was meeting people here. You know, John Stott taught profs in my class, and I got to talk to John Stott. Prof and Hendricks and I had lunch with Jim Boyce. J. Vernon McGee came into the office one day wearing the most gosh-awful Hawaiian shirt I'd ever seen in my life. The Christian celebrity that I touched me the most, besides seminary faculty, was E.V. Hill. E.V. Hill was pastor of a church in Watts, maybe one of the greatest orators I've ever heard in my life. I mean, to this, I don't remember many sermons, especially my own. But I remember a sermon he preached in 1984 at the International Congress of Biblical Inerrancy. It was staggering. He was a monstrous personality. And he was speaking at commencement at a music hall, and because I wasn't faculty at the time, Julie and I got to go pick him up at his hotel. He had a hotel he always stayed in over on Stemmons. That hotel's now a county jail. I don't know what to make of that, but he was not a tall man. I liked him for that, and he had on a black suit and a black Boulder hat, derby hat, and I took him, and he was so gracious and kind. But the thing I'll never forget is after commencement, I was waiting for him to give him a ride back, and Dr. Hill found me, went way out of his way, and came to me and said, "Mr. Wileman, if it's okay with you, Dr. Evans has asked me to go to dinner with him. Would it be okay with you if I didn't ride back with you, but instead I went with Tony Evans?" I'd never been treated that way by a celebrity. I was a nobody, still am. But to see a man with that kind of status because see, that's the real test of who you are, right? In fact, when I was at the seminary, one of the reasons I was pretty good in the administration is I had relationships with every administrative assistant in the campus because they knew the truth. And I could call the administrative assistants and say, "Tell me what's really going on over there." And because if there were an administrator or faculty that didn't treat people well, they treated Dr. Walford in the president's office well, but the staff knew. And that's the real test of people. And I'll never forget E.V. Hill for his kindness to me. Or his message. He talked about the first time he ever came to Fair Park, it was to show his prize pig at the state fair. And he grew up in Sweet Home, Texas, which is outside of Seguin. And I won't spoil it, but it's a great sermon. Few stories. Dr. Walford loved to tell the story. I can't tell all of his stories, but one of his stories he loved to tell. The chapel used to be the first floor of Davidson. I always was in my whole career was in Davidson, and the registrar's office, the president's office, until the very end. We moved over to Schaefer Chapel when we started the Leadership Center. But the first floor was chapel. And of course, they all wore suits, and there was no air conditioning. Stop and think about that. And it was September or May, and so they had ceiling fans. And Dr. Walford loved to tell the story about the students who had put talcum powder on top of the ceiling fan blades. And so just as they were starting chapel, someone flipped the switch and it rained talcum powder on all these sweaty DTS students, and they walked out looking like ghosts. I always enjoyed the story of Craig Glickman, one of the smartest faculty who was here when I was here. Craig was I think was a valedictorian at SMU in philosophy and a student of Dr. Ryrie's, and now practices law. And he was a young lifer. He grew up in Young Life at W.T. White High School. And to loosen students up for Hebrew, he would do a Young Life skit until he and Guy Owens broke the wall between classes. And they made Craig pay for the wall because they seemed like that was a little inappropriate. The story that Dr. Walford never told me, but one of the participants told me, is the Aldrich family is the closest thing to a family dynasty at Dallas Seminary. Roy Aldrich was in the first graduating class. His son, Joe, another son, can't remember his name, were here at seminary at the same time. And in the old days at the seminary, they had a function called Seating of the Seniors in the old Schaefer Chapel. It was in the beginning of the spring. Everyone was on the 4-year plan. Everyone was a THM. Everyone was male. And they would call their names and had a solemn seating of the seniors. And they would come down, each one, and sit to prepare for their senior year. And the Aldrich brothers, if you've ever read Joe Aldrich, you know he had a bit of a sense of humor. The week before the Bible conference lecture, the theme of it had been, "Is this the best the grace of God could do?" And the Aldrich brothers and my friend who told me the story said that just as they were finishing the seating of the seniors, the Aldrich brothers pulled a cord and a banner dropped behind the speaker's dais that said, "Is this the best the grace of God can do?" And Dr. Walford said, "Whoever is responsible for this will see me in my office." And my friend said, "I just hid behind the Aldriches because I knew he wouldn't kick them out." And so there's always been an element of fun here. There's always been stories. There have always been things that have gone on that you don't anticipate. I was here during the beginning of the Iran hostage crisis. My favorite story from that is that Dr. Walford walked in. Of course, Dr. Walford wrote extensively on prophecy, especially defending pre-trib rapture. But the morning after the Iranian hostage crisis, he walked in the faculty workroom and said, "Man, I hope we're right about the pre-trib rapture because this doesn't look good." So what is it about Dallas Seminary? You know, your first thought is the Bible. We have a unique curriculum. When I started the student recruitment program at Dallas, I read all the catalogs of all of our competing schools, and I went back and read all the catalogs from the history of the seminary. And it's this crazy commitment to the Bible. And that's in our logo. It's in so much that you read. In one level, you think, man, it's about God's Word. But I would say that's secondary. Of course, my old Presbyterian brothers thought it was all this dispensationalism witchcraft, and that was fun. They would accuse me of being a dispensationalist, and the Southern Presbyterian Church actually declared that heresy in the 40s. That's when Dr. Schaefer left the denomination. And I would say, what is dispensationalism? And they never knew what it was. So when they'd describe something, I'd say, well, I'm not that. And they'd say, oh, okay, good. And we'd go on down the road. I think what Dallas Seminary is, in my study of the history, in my years here, and in my continuing joy of being involved since then as alumnus, is Romans 1:16 and 17. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. At the end of the day, the only way this makes sense is that the gospel of Jesus Christ is the only thing that will save people. I've been disillusioned by ministry leaders. I've been hurt by ministry people. You all will. It's what happens. And I've hurt people. There are people that when they pray God to teach them how to forgive, my face is in their mind. That happens when you're in leadership. And ministry can be brutally hard. And for faculty who work sometimes not getting paid, and all that goes on, the sacrifice you make to be faculty here, as well as the sacrifice that the staff makes for the sake of you. I used to say when I was only staff, you know, staff is not just an infection. The thing that makes Dallas Dallas, and I'm not saying other ministries aren't that way, but the thing that was the core for me in all of my years with Dr. Walford and Dr. Campbell and Dr. Hendricks and with succeeding presidencies and faculty is the gospel of Jesus Christ is the only thing that will save us. It is the only thing that will save us. I came up through Vietnam. I've seen two presidents look, Mr. Clinton and Mr. Nixon, tell bald-faced lies in front of the cameras. We saw the huge disappointment that the Vietnam War was a mess from the beginning. I've walked through life as an American and deeply grateful for being American, and as a Christian and deeply grateful to be a boy of the church. But you know what I'll tell you? There is no one or no institution that can save people. Not a single one. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation. And the only way this place makes sense is we do it because the message of Jesus Christ is the only hope. Governments will not save the world. Churches will not save the world. In fact, when ecclesiastical powers get too great, we normally end up in bad shape. We don't do well with power historically. There's only one thing that can save, and it's the good news of Jesus Christ. And I saw men and women at this campus, and I'm encouraged to see it again today, who at the end of the day are willing to make massive sacrifices because they believe the message of Jesus is the only thing that the world has to hope for. And I hope that your experience at Dallas Seminary is as good as mine. I mean, we complained about the faculty, you know. I mean, that's what you're supposed to do, right? And we argued about grades, and we knew so much as 20-something-year-old students. We knew how to straighten out those faculty. I mean, we had all the complaining too. But when I look back, the experience was absolutely breathtaking. And I hope you have that experience. But don't be confused. Dallas Seminary isn't going to save the world. And when you graduate, you're not going to save the world. In fact, and we've done it as long as Pastor Chris and I have, you become convinced you can't save much of nothing. Right, Pastor? But the gospel of Jesus Christ is the only hope. And he has never disappointed me. One of the events that touched me most, seeing Phil Humphreys, is in 1986, that right before we started the Center for Christian Leadership, Julie and I had a stillborn child. Perfect little girl, our third daughter. And 150 from the faculty and staff and board of the seminary showed up at our graveside for an infant. What a great community this is. It was a baby, right? But it's not because we're good people. The only thing that matters, ultimately, is I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God unto salvation for the Jew first and also to the Greek. Can I beg you, don't lose that. Don't lose that. I don't care if we're infralapsarian or supralapsarian. I don't care if you sprinkle or dunk or hose. There are all kinds of things we get all worked up in seminary that are legitimate, but the one thing is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I want to tell you, I've been associated with this organization since 1977, and I've cried with leaders. I've worked through horribly difficult situations and had incredible victories. But the only thing that makes it make sense is there is one hope. One hope. And that's Jesus. Can I pray? Am I supposed to pray? Yep. I've already prayed once today, so I don't want to go over my limit. But Lord Jesus, thank you for this institution and for the incredible men and women who have sacrificed so much. And Father, thank you for the privilege of being able to be a part of it and know men and women who have made such massive sacrifices and who have such incredible gifts. But Father, don't let us get confused. Don't let us get our eyes taken off the one thing that is the hope of the world. It's the story that we are broken. Every one of us. The longer we live, the more we see our brokenness. And you are perfect, beyond our imagination. And the more we look into your face, the more humbled we are by your perfection. but Jesus gave his life to solve the problem. Father, give us a courage, a tenacity, a faithfulness, and a joy in that message. And I pray your blessing on Dallas Theological Seminary and Mark Yarborough and this faculty and staff for many, many years to come. It's in the name of Christ we pray. Amen.